Welcome back to God's Lawyer Podcast. In this episode, I want to try to ask and answer this question. What are Christian denominations, and do we even need them today? Will they survive the next 50 to 100 years of Christendom? Well, let's get into that today in this episode of God's Lawyer Podcast.
There's not a time zone in which he's not being praised. Listen to me, there is not a moment since the resurrection of Jesus where there's not someone somewhere declaring that Jesus saved.
Well, I recently came across, I subscribed to a few different magazines. Yes, I still actually get the paper copies. I know, I can't believe it. I've got the European Conservative here on my desk. I also have a couple issues of the New Criterion. I've got the Federalist paper. That comes because I'm a member of the Federalist Society. And I've got a copy here of the American Conservative, the November-December 2024 issue. All kinds of things going on. And I found an article on the United Methodist Church, Methodism. And we see this trend really, we've seen it amongst the Episcopalians and the Methodists here. It's happened to the Baptists and Presbyterians over the past, really 30 or 40 years. We've seen breakups, divisions, splits. Some of these denominations are just dying outright. And so the author is W. James Antill III, and he says, "Whither Methodism?" And it's a question. It says, "The one-time largest mainline denomination has been riven over America's peculiar social issues. The United Methodist Church continues to divide with the African, and I believe it's the African and, let's see here, I know the African United Methodist churches have broken away from the United Methodist Church, and we're also seeing that happen in the United States in different pockets. So the question is, what are denominations? What are Christian denominations? It's something particular to Protestants because you have the Roman Catholic Church, and then, of course, you have the Eastern Orthodox Church. And so all those churches within those two movements fall under the headship of either a central body or central figure. Now, there are obviously iterations and variations within both, but so we're really in a very particular lane here known as Protestantism. And within Protestantism, you basically have this almost a ceaseless splintering and then regathering and splintering, regathering of Protestants. It's just inherent. It's part of our nature. We are driven, that is, to a biblical fidelity, and then there's seasons when that fidelity falls away, and we see division or collapse, and then we'll see moments of revival, of renewal back to biblical fidelity. Then you'll see the gathering and the coalescing of like-minded churches and individuals to continue to wage that good warfare, holding faith and a good conscience. So what do we do during this season? First of all, take a step back and understand why denominations were a blessing at one point in history. At one point in Christendom, denominations were a blessing. Here's why they were a blessing, because you had many pastors. If you think about it, on the frontiers, Methodists and Baptists particularly, many pastors did not have formal education, nor did the churches have the resources to gather, whether it's Bible studies, study material, even Bibles or missions material. Most churches are starting during this big movement of particularly Methodist and Baptist churches. They're starting in an era where you got that frontier pastor. You have the circuit riding pastors. They're on horseback and they're riding from church to church. You have many pastors who are farmers. I think of a particular man here locally, 125 years ago, started many of the older Southern Baptist churches that are here. I think he started 3 or 4 of them, but he was a farmer and planting churches. So the resources they just weren't available. So what happens is a denomination allows churches of like mind, like faith to, if you will, be able to have access to resources. What they would do is each church would give a percentage of their overall tithes and offerings to a local association, a state conference, and then a national conference. And what they were able to do then is by combining that money, those state conferences or national conference or local association was able to generate materials and produce study guides, evangelism material. They were able to provide training locally right there in the association where the pastors were. They were providing them information. And then more often than not, those who were leading the state conventions or even sometimes the associations were considered probably, if you will, ministry experts, because they were more than likely the only ones who probably had gone off and received formal seminary education or training. This wasn't always the case in the cities. I'm really talking about the frontier. The other blessing that the denominations were for a long time was that churches were able, so let's say your local church had 100 people and most of you were farmers or laborers, and the tithes and offerings really aren't a whole lot. You can't even afford to pay the pastor just to be full-time and focused only on pastoring. He also would have to work or farm. So how are you going to support a missionary full-time on the field? What would happen is they would give to missions, and they would combine those offerings, and they were able then to send thousands of missionaries around the world and continue to this very day. I think of the International Mission Board, who continues that very effort, doing that today. Now, we know there's a number of other mission sending agencies and organizations, so there's the blessing. But let's get down to why I really want to talk about this. I believe that denominations, as they exist now, have outlived their shelf life. Here's why. I'm going to give you 7 reasons why I believe that denominations are largely irrelevant. First of all, the good old boy system. What started as an inherently mission-minded, ministry-driven organization structure, whatever denomination you're talking about, turns quickly into, it goes quickly from the body of Christ to a body politic. And we can just call it what it is. It's the good old boy system. This is a turnoff to young evangelicals. I mean, it's basically you take national politics and you baptize it in Christianity, slap a Jesus bumper sticker on it, and you got the same thing. Backroom deals, negotiations, alliances, movements, groups, trying to get a group of people to show up and vote. How much of your base can you get out to vote? How can you get the word out? And then there's these constant, ongoing 24/7 debates on Twitter, YouTube, podcasts, over all sorts of minutia, and the person in the pew is supposed to finance this, to finance the good old boy system. Well, I can tell you that most young evangelicals are turned off by this, but the other reason I think that they're turned off by this is because it's like a pay-to-play scheme. Here's the deal, and for you to advance in the denomination, for you to get a spot on key committees and all expenses paid trips to trustees meetings where you can rub elbows with the kingmakers of the convention, well, you have to lead your church to give a substantial amount of money. It's a pay-to-play system. I've sat in rooms where I've heard them say point blank that we need to create a system to where if churches don't give a certain percentage, then those pastors cannot have positions on committees, and then those churches should also be limited in how many messengers they can send to vote, how many votes they have. And so it becomes a way for the good old boy system to protect itself, to insulate itself. I think you also see this too. If you invite somebody from a denominational leadership team or organization to your church to speak, all you're hearing is statistics. They're doing this, they're doing that. It's a constant fundraising thing. I mean, it's constant. It's nonstop. Those who are leading denominational state conventions, organizations, associations, it's nonstop fundraising. That's what it's about. It's all about self-preservation. Now, let me go back to, there was a time when those were the subject matter experts. These were ministry experts. That day is far past. I mean, when I think about going and finding resources for the church or for myself as a pastor, the last place that I would think to turn would be to an association or denomination, whether it be a state level or national level. It's the last place I think to turn. Now, I do think there's still a place there for combining resources to send missionaries. But that's the last. I have no interest in that. Why? Because I realize those in those positions were not put there because they're subject matter experts or because they're ministry experts. They're put there because of the pay-to-play scheme and because they knew the right people, they knew the kingmakers, and it's all politics all the time. Young evangelicals are turned off by that. Can you imagine telling a young family in your church, hey, the wife, she's decided to not work because she's going to homeschool the kids, and the husband, he's working a job as a mechanic, or he's a postman, or whatever. He's a truck driver, school teacher, whatever, right? And he's tithing. They give tithes and offerings. And look, they don't have a lot, but they're happy. And you are encouraging the church to give more and more and more to support enormous salaries, either in an association, state convention, or national convention. Listen, I don't have a problem with someone making a good salary. That's not my problem. My problem is that when a pastor is encouraging his church to give more so that he can be on key committees and be in places where he's around people of influence, and this family, you think that family is going to be okay with that? You say, how do you know this? Because this is how I learned ministry early on, and I had to come to reject this. I had to come to reject this outright. I realized really fast that this system is a system where they eat their own, and I have watched it. I have watched those who were once powerful be devoured by other powerful men. And I can tell you this, they're constantly at each other. It's constant backbiting. It's constant manipulation. It is constant posturing and positioning, and it looks like the United States Congress, except for we've baptized it in Christianity and we threw the Jesus bumper sticker on it. Well, younger evangelicals are turned off by this. Another reason why denominations, I think, are becoming absolutely irrelevant is because the message is always vanilla. It has nothing to it. There's no impact. Look, here's the reality: is denominational leaders are not going to call out, other than you might see them on Twitter occasionally once the dust has already been kicked up on an issue, right? I mean, I can think of a recent issue where there were key leaders in the evangelical world saying nothing about overt sin, but then suddenly when the person's caught, they're all running out there, wanting to offer a word of condemnation. Where were you in the revelation of that? Here's the reality: is you will never have an associational leader, state leader, national leader come into your church and talk about sin that's local, personal, real, happening in that church. Period. They never would. If they knew of a sin in that church, they would avoid speaking on it. They won't come to that church. Why? Because the message is always vanilla. It is generic. More often than not, it's just the same sermons recycled anyway. They get huge honorariums. I can remember when I was in convention leadership, I won't say where, but I can remember the honorariums for speaking at a state-supported convention. I mean by state, by the state denomination, where just to speak at a 20-minute breakout session, actually to speak at 20-minute breakout sessions, the honorarium was $2,500. Keynote speakers, you can imagine, way more. Think about that. And all the speakers are already people drawing full-time salaries, either from the state convention, from a missions organization, or from a church. That's just a little inside baseball. So the message has to be vanilla. It has to be vanilla. It has to be generic. It can never be strong. Although, listen, just because you're raising your voice or you're getting excited in the pulpit doesn't mean that message is strong. It's always a generic Jesus. It's always some form of pietism with a magical incantation slapped on the end. No, young evangelicals are turned off by that. They don't want that. They want real, strong leadership. They want leadership that's willing to stand out front, and if it costs them something, so be it. You're not going to find that in denominational leadership. Well, I mentioned a few other things. Let me mention this. The young evangelicals are investing locally, and locally first, rightfully so. We've been told that, we've got to take the gospel to the nations, and you can only do it through this missions organization. What we're discovering now is, while that may have been true one time, that may have been true, and certainly I think in many cases was, the only way you get the gospel to the nations was through these missions organizations or entities. A local church that, most of the people were barely making it weren't going to be able to put a team together, put them on a, back then on a boat or something, and send them around the world. Churches are able to do that. So what you're finding too, beyond being able to do that, is local organizations, local associations, local networks of like-minded churches are focused on local issues. Here's the reality is that we've got to circle back. Now, I'm for international missions. I always have been and I always will be. Why? Because the Scriptures teaches us to, and our Lord commands us to. But I don't believe that we're to make disciples in the nations. I believe we're to make disciples of the nations. There's to be a holistic conversion of the nations. That is systemically, every aspect of that society and culture. And yes, it always begins and continues with the preaching of the gospel. But I promise you this, the gospel that comes to transform a life intends for those lives to transform the society and culture around them, holistically based on gospel principles. So young evangelicals, they're investing locally. They want to see local ministry. They want to see now for some, local ministry just means that you go find people who are in need and you hand out food and you drive back to your affluent community and pretend like you've done something, as you gave someone a fish. Now, look, I think it's a great thing to help someone who doesn't have food today by giving them food. But that isn't what it means to invest locally. Investing locally understands that that's the end of the stream. Let's go to the head of the stream and let's start asking questions about how did we get to the point to where there are people who are in a position where they need food. We'll say, oh, we just need more government programs. We need more government handout. Well, we've got more government programs than we've ever had. And we still have these nonstop issues. Why? Because government programs are about bureaucracy. They're about appointments, and it's a good old boy system, just like in these denominations where your friends get paid. That's it. And you pretend like you're doing some good. So young evangelicals want to focus locally. They want to see that investment in their local community. How are we working to transform this local community? How are we being missionaries right here at home? And so there's a turnoff when you have somebody in a denomination come in and they're talking all these big numbers and did this and did that. But the reality is those numbers never correlate with meaningful transformation. And then we hear this, the firebrand, well, it's just all about preaching the gospel. Okay, let's preach the gospel. But is the gospel just a magical incantation where somebody asks Jesus into their heart and that's it? Is that it? Or is the gospel the euangelion in the Greek, which means that it is the announcement of the arrival of a king, a great king, who demands absolute and complete obedience to him and the mission of his kingdom. See, this isn't about just simply putting Jesus into your heart. This is about bowing your knee before the King of Kings and then living absolutely sold out for him. Young evangelicals are seeing that. They want that. They don't want the denominational brand. It means nothing to them. It means absolutely nothing. If somebody says, well, I'm a 50th generation Southern Baptist. We hear stupid talk like that all the time. Who cares? Look, your neighbor who's an unbeliever doesn't care. They just don't care. That's not even a credential. That's absolutely stupid, absolutely ridiculous. I asked my father, how many generations back do we go as Southern Baptists? I think I would then be the 5th generation back. But that means nothing. Absolutely nothing. It gives me no standing, no credibility. It just absolutely shows that some people are bought into a brand. Why do I need a brand? Here's the brand I need, Christian. I'm a Christian. That's my brand. That's what young evangelicals want. They're so sick and tired of this absurd nonsense that's this denominational branding. They want no part of that. That's why we're seeing the young people turning more and more to the robust message of the gospel that seeks and has its goal to claim the nations for Christ. Well, I'm going to end it with a few more here. You say, man, you've been really hard on denominations. Well, that's because I want you to understand something, that they are not affecting the great change that they claim they're affecting. They are cashing your checks and enriching themselves. I can tell you this, why do you not get access to the books? I mean, if your church is investing money in that denomination, how come you don't know what salaries are paid? How come you don't know what compensation levels are? How come you don't get to see in the books? How is it that the denominational leaders pick the trustees of these entities and organizations? And they always pick from the same crop of people. How is it that those leading those entities and organizations get a say in who the trustees are going to be of those organizations? Well, you just have the good old boy system, and it continuously it perpetuates the same nonsense. But yet, the only way to be a good Christian, the only way to be a good Presbyterian or good Methodist or good Baptist is if your church is sending these percentages of money so they can continue to make sure that their friends have a seat at the table. No thanks. Young evangelicals are saying no. Absolutely not. Do not send part of our tithes and offerings to that nonsense pastor. The top-down approach is not something young evangelicals are interested in. Who is it? Well, because you hold an office in a denomination. Denominations, we don't even find them in the Bible, so they're man-made. They're created. We certainly could see a purposeful network and association of churches, yes. But this idea that the head of United Methodist Church speaks for all Methodists, that the head of the Presbyterian, which that thing split multiple times, speaks for all Presbyterians, or the head of the American Baptist speaks for or the head of the Southern Baptist Convention speaks for all Southern Baptists? Absolutely not. That's absurd and absolutely ridiculous. You do not. I think about, for Southern Baptists, we think about the ERLC, the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission. I think I got that right. They don't speak for Southern Baptists on moral issues. They haven't for a long time. Russell Moore made sure that organization became basically a leftist think tank and cesspool, and then he took that same leftist cesspool thinking and ruined a magazine with it as well. Finally, let me say this. Smaller associations and networks allow for greater involvement. See, you got to pay to play to get into the big times, and you got to know the kingmakers. It's no different than the United States House of Representatives or the Senate or your state political parties. It's no different. These denominations are exactly the same. Your involvement is depending on who you know and how much money you've brought to the table. Young evangelicals want to be involved in a local network. Why? Because they want to have some skin in the game. They want to invest. They want to know that their voice and that their contribution matters. That's why we've got to find more like-minded churches. We've got to find them. We've got to gather them. There's networks popping up all over the place. Here's the problem, though, and I want to say this to any of my viewers who are boomers watching. I absolutely respect the boomer generation more than I can express. The hard work, tenacity, faithfulness, loyalty, generosity, almost unmatched, almost unparalleled, okay? But here's the thing. Many of you need to rethink this. You need to rethink the associations that your church has with other churches, denominations, or networks. Here's why. Here's why you need to rethink it. Because this whole brand identity, it's gone. It's bankrupt. It doesn't mean anything anymore. We need to be willing to partner with churches. We may not have every single exact doctrine the same as the church down the street. And by the way, not all Methodists, not all Baptists, even if they're in the same denomination, believe the same thing. I heard a man has absolutely made one of the most absolutely ignorant statements. And I mean ignorant as he's uninformed and intentionally uninformed. So he has no idea what he's talking about, nor does he want to actually find out, because it's just better to walk around and sound ignorant than be informed. And wanted to say, well, this is established fill-in-the-blank denomination doctrine. And then you can read the denomination's doctrinal statement. It says nothing what he said, but it's firmly established. I'm like, okay, whatever. You clearly have no idea what you're talking about. Well, he's just bought into a brand identity and then speaks from a position of ignorance, not a position of being informed. Young people are informed, and the boomers I know are informed people. We need to look for associations and partnerships. We may not agree with every single aspect of doctrine. However, if we've got those core components down, there's potential partnerships at varying degrees and levels. We need to throw off this idea that there's tens of thousands of churches that believe exactly like we believe and are committed because we all have the same brand identity. That's actually a myth even within the denomination, so don't buy into that. Here's the answer at the end of the day. People say, well, the answer is just to return to focus only on the local church. Actually, I disagree with that. The focus should be shifted with this understanding. All right, let me give this to you. If you hung on to the end, we're going to just a little pot of gold here right at the end, okay? No individual church, now whether it's a Roman Catholic church, a Baptist church, a Presbyterian church, Greek Orthodox church, period, doesn't matter. Protestant, Roman Catholic, Greek Orthodox, period. No one individual congregation, local church is itself the true church. Here's why I say that. Because when you think about it, your local church, now I don't agree with Roman Catholic doctrine, don't agree with Eastern Orthodox doctrine, don't agree with much of Methodism, period. I'm a Baptist. But your local congregation that gathers for worship is not made up of 100% of believers. It's intermingled. The wheat and the tares are intermingled. So no one church is going to be able to say it is the absolute true church. Here's what I can say. The universal church. Now, I don't mean the universal church as a denomination, whether it's United Methodist, Southern Baptist, Roman Catholics, Eastern Orthodox. I don't mean that. I mean the universal church, which is made up of true believers spread around the world, but not just who are alive today, but through the generations. The universal church is the true church, and the universal church is manifested in believers who gather locally, okay? So I believe that the focus, while ministry focus is local, while we're reinvesting locally, we have to take a step back and once again celebrate and have a focus on the universal church, because a focus on the universal church says that, look, the charismatic down the street, we may disagree on spiritual gifts, but we agree on the gospel. We're both part. If we've repented and believed, we're part of the universal church. The Methodist and the Presbyterian may disagree on the doctrine of election, but both believe in the exclusivity of Jesus Christ, that a person must repent and believe. They're part of the universal church if they've repented and believed. We've got to circle that back. I think that's the answer. Circling back, understanding the importance of the universal church and its manifestation locally. I told you, there's the pot of gold at the end. Well, until the nations are converted, there can be no excuses, no retreat, and absolutely no surrender. Why? Because Jesus Christ is King.